It is so clear from your excellent conversations on the discussion boards that you are all acutely aware of how much the world has changed since we began this class, dropping down into history around the year 1500. All kinds of diverse cultures and societies on every continent in the world, all with ancient roots in history, have begun to become more interconnected and integrated through the process that we call globalization. And as you have also all recognized and analyzed at some length in your quizzes and discussions, globalization was not at all a neutral process, but one driven by imperialism. In particular, Western or European forms of empire that emerged dramatically on the world stage as early as the 15th century. From roughly 1500 to 1750 or 1800 about, we saw the establishment of new links between parts of the world that had only sporadic contact before 1500, including the wholly unprecedented connections between two parts of the world once completely separated, the Eastern and Western hemispheres. Historians call this period the early modern period, and your text describes this period as the origins of global interdependence. But this was obviously just the beginning of the story of globalization. We're now moving into the next major chapter of this story, what we call, no surprise here, the late modern period, from roughly 1750 to 1914. In this period, the broad trends we identified and studied in the early modern period increase, expanding in scope, scale, and intensity, transforming nearly every aspect of our lives and interactions. Between 1750 and 1914, European empires continued expanding, growing larger and more powerful, so that the process of globalization, as you've all recognized, was shaped largely by European ambitions, economic motives, and ideologies, creating great global imbalances. As the textbook says, you can find this on page 477, the late modern period can be distinguished from the early modern period by several intensifying and innovative developments, including the rise of nation states and nationalism, heavy industrialization, which spawned unprecedented technologies, powerful weapons, and accelerated transportation and communication between distant parts of the world. But the crucial point for understanding how globalization happened is that this process of so-called modernization was an incredibly uneven one, largely favoring European powers and enabling them to achieve political and economic dominance of the world. This dominance was so widespread and effective that we call it global hegemony. For the next 4 weeks, we're going to continue to focus on this next period in world history, as always keeping in mind our ongoing study of the evolution of globalization, but with an emphasis now on the profound and painful shifts in power that European hegemony created, or what we're calling here global imbalances. Now, as I want you to keep in mind, as we go through this, I want you to keep in mind the third theme of our overall class, which is cross-cultural interactions. Obviously, we have all along been analyzing the connections and relations between diverse cultures and societies of Asia, Europe, the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Americas, etc. But in this next stage of world history, you'll want to be particularly attentive to the disparities in power that globalization as a process of European empire building created in these cross-cultural relationships. It's also time to begin paying attention to the last two themes of this course, modernization and nationalism. Modernization is a very complex topic. It means many things, but arguably the process of modernization is, at its core, an economic one. And the big story here is the onset of industrialization. Industrialization, linked very closely with the advance of global capitalism, is a uniquely modern phenomenon by which human beings began harnessing entirely new sources of energy and organization of production in factories. I say it's uniquely modern because throughout all previous world history until the onset of industrialization, agriculture remained the economic heart of virtually every society on Earth, and it will continue to do so for well into the modern period. Throughout this older history, energy was harnessed through two main sources, the sun and muscle power. Industrialization encouraged massive and constant innovation, the dislocation of workers from their agricultural rhythms, and new economic regimes to propel propel production to higher and higher levels. And as your textbook states, this time on page 633, over time, industrial societies became economically much stronger than agricultural societies, and industrial production brought about greater improvements in standard of living. But again, the process was also uneven, destabilizing, and world-changing, as the most colonized regions around the world found themselves wrenched into global systems in which their main function was to provide raw resources, agricultural products, and labor and markets for the European empires. All of the countless effects of this process might be called modernization. And here are the key questions to keep in mind about this as we move forward and you work on your research projects. First of all, of course, what is modernization? Second, what does it mean to be modern? Third, how did modernization relate to the rise and fall of imperialism? So keep all these in mind as we move into this next stage of the class. And then there is nationalism. We've begun studying the major revolutions that rocked the world in the late modern period. Traditionally viewed as emerging from the political and ideological revolutions in Europe and North America in the 18th century, nationalism was part of a modern questioning of many previous ways of organizing human societies. It's a complex concept with pre-modern components involved. Nationalism was a force that challenged in many places and in many places abolished older institutions like monarchy and religion as the basis for political organization, restructuring governments and societies across the world. Again, as your textbook states on 632-633, first in Europe and later in the Americas as well, revolutions and the conflicts that followed from them encouraged the formation of national identities. States seeking to pursue the interests of national communities were able to mobilize popular support on a scale never before achieved, and often enjoyed success in conflicts with neighboring peoples who had not been able to organize effective nation states. The idea of organizing states around national communities was eventually influenced political development all throughout the world. Of course, a key question we need to attack is, what does nationalism mean? And we will. But then we need to go further and ask, how was nationalism linked to the expansion of European imperialism? And then second, and very importantly, how did non-European nationalist movements begin to challenge the imperial heart of globalization? Now, this last question is very important. As we launch into this age of global imbalances, it is crucial to recognize that people all around the world never submitted passively to colonialism. Even in the cauldron of globalization, as European empires spread their economic and political power around the world, the cultures, societies, and empires of Asia, Africa, and the Americas always participated actively in the process, from cooperation and collaboration to sustained, often fierce and violent resistance. And that participation in the expansion of modernization, nationalization, and globalization was just as critical in shaping the world we live in today. You cannot fully understand what global interdependence means without appreciating the roles that everyone played, the colonizer and the colonized, in the process. One of the most significant items in the history of globalization, perhaps the most significant one, is probably somewhere on your and my body right now. I'm talking about cotton. Cotton is by far the most popular fiber in the world and is so much a part of our daily modern lives that we hardly even notice it. We wash and dry our bodies with it, we sleep in sheets and pillowcases made from it, and of course we wear it. We wear it all the time as shirts, jeans, dresses, hats, coats, shoelaces, and on and on. In the United States alone, farm production of raw cotton every year involves the purchase of more than $5.3 billion worth of supplies and services. And that's just the agricultural piece of the story. After leaving the farm, the process and handling of cotton, its transformation into usable items, and its distribution and sale stimulates annual revenue in the United States alone of more than $120 billion. Cotton has been for more than 2 centuries and remains today the United States' #1 crop. That is why the cotton industry, what it means by its self-interested slogan, the fabric of our lives. Cotton comes from a shrub that is native to tropical and subtropical regions all around the world, including the Americas, Asia, Africa. Unlike other plants like tobacco, the potato, and wheat, cotton was domesticated independently in both the eastern and the western hemispheres, and as far back as prehistoric times. Fabrics spun from cotton have been found as much as 6,000 years ago in the Indus River Valley in modern-day Pakistan. Soon after that, in world history terms, cotton was cultivated and domesticated in the Americas, first in Mexico and later in Peru. In ancient times, the use of cotton for textiles spread from India to Arabia, Iran, and later China, and was traded across the Americas north and south. By the time of Columbus's arrival in the Americas, there were sophisticated and well-developed cotton textile industries in India, China, and the Americas. Indian cotton was especially prized across the exchange networks known as the Silk Trade that linked the regions of the Eurasian continent through trade beginning at least 2,500 years ago. And its popularity among one group of humans in particular, Europeans, would have profound and transformative consequences for the entire world in the modern age. Northern Europeans in the Middle Ages learned about cotton as an imported fiber without any idea of how it was made. At this point, one of the largest centers of textile production in the world was Mughal India. In fact, it was India's #1 manufacturing industry. India had over the centuries invented technologies and processes to harvest cotton and to produce textiles in a wide variety of styles and colors. Entranced by these fabrics, demand in Europe rose, leading to the beginning of a homegrown textile industry in Europe itself, most notably in Great Britain. Of course, this European startup in the Middle Ages had one major disadvantage. There was no cotton farming. Considerably north on the globe, the climate in Europe was no good for growing cotton, which requires tropical and semi-tropical climates. The fledgling cotton manufacturers in England had to import raw bulk cotton to supply its emerging manufactories. Meanwhile, the English East India Company, as part of its expansion into the Indian Ocean region, had begun flooding the European market with cheaper and much high-quality textiles from India. In fact, the competition from India was so fierce that Parliament passed a series of acts in the early 18th century to stop the importation of cotton cloth from abroad in an attempt to buttress the new industries at home. Despite this, until the 19th century, Indian cloths continued to maintain a competitive advantage until the power of the expanding British Empire and the East India Company grew to such a point that it was able to begin exerting military, political, and economic control over India. What followed was a concerted policy of controlling the cotton market, in which Britain used its power and position to suppress the Indian textile industry and force it to open its markets to British goods, which could be sold in the subcontinent without tariffs or duties compared to local Indian producers who were heavily taxed. With these tax and import-export policies, the British Empire was able, over the 19th century, to reverse the initial flow of exchange and trade. In this imperial scheme, India became a market for British goods, as its native textile industry was deliberately reduced, and it became a major source for raw cotton production to fuel the textile industries in England. To meet the demands of British business and empire, India was deindustrialized. And this was mirrored precisely by the opposite process in England. Under the emerging global regime of exchange propelled by imperialism, Britain funneled its increasing control of the world cotton market into a dramatically expanded textile manufacturing sector that fueled the Industrial Revolution. Its cotton and cotton textile industry was supported by imports of raw cotton from the plantations of its colonial empire, especially India and its colonies in British North America, and the development of technologies to increase its own production exponentially. A crucial innovation in this regard was the invention of the cotton gin by the American Eli Whitney in 1793. This new device made the extraction of seeds from cotton bolls 1,000,000 times easier, shifting the process from human hands to the new machine. As a result, Cotton production boomed spectacularly, exploding industrialization in England and other parts of Europe, while India was forced into the role of colonial exporter of raw materials on the periphery of empire. The consequences of this unprecedented shift in the world of cotton production cannot be exaggerated. It is the quintessential example of the way in which the process of globalization created both a more tightly integrated world of interdependence and a wrenching reorientation of regional economies in a way that produced profound global imbalances.